Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck 185 and it's titled I Just Can't Wait to Be King. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card was suggested to us by Leo over on Discord, and that card is Starscream Power Hungry, or on the backside, Starscream Seeker Leader. So Starscream is 3 and a black for a 2/3 legendary artifact creature robot. It has more than meets the eye for 2 and a black, so we can cast the backside for 3. It has flying, and whenever you draw a card, if you're the Monarch, target opponent loses 2 life, and whenever one or more creatures deal combat damage to you, convert Starscream. Then on the back, it is a 2/3 vehicle. It's got living metal, so as long as it's our turn, this vehicle is also a creature. It has flying, menace, haste, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, if there is no Monarch, that player becomes the Monarch, and whenever you become the Monarch, convert Starscream. So there is a lot going on with this card, but as you may have noticed, it is a legendary creature. That means that our commander for the week is going to be Starscream, because an unspoken rule on the channel is if we get a legendary creature or something that can legally be our commander, then obviously we have to make it the commander to fully build around it. But let's jump into some of our key pieces of this deck, some of our themes, some of the things that are really making this deck function. And we can kind of pick apart what makes Starscream such a unique and powerful commander. So the very first theme that I want to touch on is going to be monarchy. Since Starscream cares about us having the monarchy, we want to put as many creatures and artifacts and enchantments and everything else in the deck that also care about us being the monarch. So a good example of that is Custody Lich, which is 3 black for a 4/2 zombie cleric. When it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch, and whenever you become the Monarch, target player sacrifices a creature. This is going to be especially relevant because we do kind of intend on giving our opponents the monarchy, considering that's what the backside of Starscream does, and so we are going to keep taking the monarchy over and over in an attempt to try to keep triggering effects like Custody Lich, and this is going to give us the ability to give the monarchy and other things away to our opponents, so that way they may or may not feel like attacking us. We might be kind of helping the table, but in a way that benefits us more than everybody else. So with that in mind, the second theme is very similar to the monarchy. That one is initiative. So in a similar way that if you hit somebody who is the monarch, you become the monarch, the initiative is the same thing. Once we hit someone who has the initiative, we take it, and if we have it at the beginning of our upkeep, we venture into the dungeon. So we want to use cards like Passageway Seer, which is 3 and a black for a 2/2 Tiefling Warlock with lifelink. When Passageway Seer enters the battlefield, you take the initiative, and at the beginning of your end step, if you have the initiative, put a +1/+1 counter on Passageway Seer. So this is going to be one of the best ways that we can ensure that we are drawing cards with the monarchy while also getting some additional value with the initiative. This is going to force our opponents to try to get it from us, maybe from each other, and it's a great way to help us promote combat throughout the course of the game. Now that does lead us to a problem of how do we get the monarchy or the initiative back from our opponents if our opponents have some way to stop us? And that answer is with our third theme, which is Deathtouch. We are leaning very hard into 1 to 2 mana creatures that have Deathtouch and some more expensive ones that have some special abilities, because we want to ensure that if we're attacking our opponents, they're essentially forced to choose between, do they sacrifice a creature to block our Deathtouch creatures, or do they let us hit them so we can reclaim the monarchy and the initiative? So with that in mind, we have cards like Gifted Aetherborn, which is black for a Aetherborn vampire. It's a 2/3, and it has Deathtouch and lifelink. So if we can load our board up with these kinds of creatures, not only does it make it difficult for our opponents to keep the initiative and the monarchy, but it also makes it difficult for them to take it from us, because we can just block with a Deathtouch creature and kill pretty much anything that comes at us, and so it really makes our opponents question if they want to attack us. but hopefully we can give away the Monarchy and the Initiative enough to incentivize attacking our other opponents as well. But those are our themes for the week. So the next thing we got to do is take a look at some key cards. These are the cards that really help the deck push toward a victory. It helps synergize. There's a lot of very important value engines and win conditions in here, but we're only going to highlight 3 in particular. So the first key card that I want to highlight is going to be Hooded Blightfang. And Hooded Blightfang is 2 and a black for a 1/4 snake. It has Deathtouch. Whenever a creature you control with Deathtouch attacks, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Then, whenever a creature you control with Deathtouch deals damage to a planeswalker, destroy that planeswalker. There's not a ton of Deathtouch synergies in Magic. That's one of the keywords that doesn't have a ton of specific support. So Hooded Blightfang being able to drain our opponents every single time we attack with a creature with Deathtouch means that we can speed the game up much quicker than it looks, because we can swing with just 1/1s and 2/2s that have Deathtouch and make sure that each one of them is draining our opponents for 1 while we gain a life, making it more likely that our opponents can attack into us to take the Monarchy, to take the Initiative, and then we can attack back into them to take it back, do some more damage, maybe kill some creatures with our Deathtouch creatures. And it really gets to the point where it's very difficult for our opponents to stop us because we do have a lot of incidental life gain, but the Deathtouch creatures just get so much better once Hooded Blightfang is in play that it really gets difficult for them to really set up a situation where we're not just taking the Monarchy every single turn. Moving on, though, to our next key card. This one is No Mercy. No Mercy is 2 black for an enchantment. Whenever a creature deals damage to you, destroy it. And this is probably one of the best cards in the entire deck, as you may be able to tell by the $7 price tag. But it's really going to be effective at making sure we keep the Monarchy and the Initiative, because if our opponents have to decide to attack us, they essentially have to attack into a wall of Deathtouch creatures, and then anything that survives, hits us, and takes the Monarchy is then destroyed in the process. So our opponents really have to gauge whether it's worth it just to draw a card at the end of their turn or to get some value off of the Initiative when they know they're going to be losing their creatures. It's not just a maybe we won't block with our Deathtouch creatures, it's definitely guaranteed. So No Mercy really plays a lot of mind games with the table, and it helps push combat away from us and towards some of our other opponents. And then finally, our last key card that I want to highlight is going to be Henrika Domnathi. And Henrika is 2 black for a 1/3 vampire. She has flying, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, choose one that hasn't been chosen. Either each player sacrifices a creature, you draw a card and lose 1 life, or you can transform Henrika into Henrika Infernal Seer. And the backside is really why we want her for this deck, because like I mentioned earlier, there's not a ton of specific Deathtouch support, and Henrika is probably one of the best. She's a 3/4 vampire with flying, Deathtouch, and lifelink, and you can pay 1 black, and each creature you control with flying, Deathtouch, and or lifelink gets +1/+0 until the end of turn. So this means we can attack an opponent with, say, 3 1/1s with Deathtouch, and they can decide if they want to let through possibly a lot more damage, because we could pump them all to 2 and then 3 and hit them for 9, or do they want to try to block them with their creatures, which are gonna die anyway to the Deathtouch. So Henrika really makes the difficulty in attacking switch from, is it difficult to attack us, to is it difficult to block us? So we really want to make sure that combat is promoted, but also very tricky for our opponents. And Henrika does a phenomenal job at making sure that that is exactly the case. So that is the end of our key cards. And the next thing I want to do for this deck tech is take a look at some cool interactions. These are cards that synergize very well with each other, and in some cases can be win conditions or value engines all on their own. So the very first cool interaction I want to talk about is between Psychosis Crawler and Necrologia. So Psychosis Crawler is 5 mana for a star artifact creature Phyrexian Horror. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your hand, and whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. So this is already going to be pretty powerful with our deck because we do intend on drawing quite a few cards to make up for Starscream's ability to make each opponent lose life whenever we're drawing cards. But we're really going to want to partner that up with Necrologia, which is 3 black for an instant. We can play Necrologia only during our discard phase, and we can pay X life and draw X cards. So with Psychosis Crawler, we can pay pretty much all of our life except for 1, going down to 1 life. So if we're at our starting life total of 40, pay 39, draw 39 cards, and then Psychosis Crawler is going to make each opponent lose 39 life. So if we have any way in there to draw an additional card, maybe we just had Psychosis Crawler in play and drew a card for our turn, as long as all of our opponents are at a lower life total than we are, we can guarantee that with Necrologia and Psychosis Crawler to automatically win the game. Now, obviously, there are a plenty of other cards that can draw a ton of cards or do damage when we draw cards, but Necrologia being able to draw as many cards as we have life makes it by far the best option for knocking people out with Psychosis Crawler. Moving on, though, to our next cool interaction. This one is going to be between Archpriest of Shadows and Grave Titan. So Archpriest of Shadows is 3 black for a 4/4 human warlock. It has backup for 1, and then it has Deathtouch, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player or battle, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And one of the biggest creatures we've got in the entire deck that could get back with the Archpriest is Grave Titan at 4 black for a 6/6 giant. It has Deathtouch, and whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, create 2/2 black zombie creature tokens. So there's a couple of key things going on with these 2 cards here. The first one is, of course, that the Archpriest can back up the Grave Titan if we need to attack with it, because the odds of our opponents being able to kill an attacking 7/7 with Deathtouch is very slim, plus it means we're attacking and getting zombies. But even if that's not the case, we're backing something up, or even backing up the Archpriest itself, we can then get the Grave Titan back out of the graveyard if it dies, meaning we can make more zombies, we still have a 6/6 that can keep attacking, and as long as we have Archpriest that can keep attacking every single turn, we could actually get back Grave Titan every single turn, so we could attack, maybe it dies in combat, we get it back, and then all of a sudden, we've got 2 zombies from the attack, 2 zombies from it entering the battlefield, and then next turn we just repeat the process. So Archpriest is a huge value engine in this deck, and Grave Titan is just by far one of the best reanimation targets we've got. So those are our cool interactions for this deck. And the next thing we're going to do is take a look at the price of the deck. And this week, the total price came out to $70.65, with the most expensive card in the deck being Virtus the Veiled at $8.85. So I will be perfectly honest, when I put Virtus into this deck, I had no idea it was actually this expensive. In my mind, this is still like a 50-cent card, so I did not know it had spiked up this much. And so if you're interested in some Battle Bond cards, if you've got Virtus and his partner Gorm laying around, you might want to check in on those. But Virtus is perfect for this deck because he's 2 and a black for a 1/1 Azra Assassin. He does partner with Gorm the Great, which we can't play Gorm because Gorm is green and we're a mono black deck. But he does have Deathtouch, and whenever he deals combat damage to a player, that player loses half their life rounded up. So yes, it's 3 mana for a 1/1, but it does fit the theme of what we want to be doing because he does have Deathtouch, and if he does manage to hit somebody, he's making them lose half of their life, which is a huge swing in our favor, especially when we have Starscream making people lose life. We've got Psychosis Crawler, we've got all of our other drain effects and life gain effects. So Virtus really puts in a ton of work, and it's probably going to be enemy number 1 when it hits the board. Nobody's going to want to take a hit from Virtus. They will pretty much do anything they can to stop it, and unfortunately, because it is a 1/1, it is very easy to stop, but it will be guaranteed to take something with it. So I do think Virtus is worth the inclusion if you don't mind the $8, but if you did want to trim down on the price of the deck, there are a lot of Deathtouch creatures that I could not include because that's one of Black's specialties, so you could very easily replace him with a cheaper Deathtouch creature, and it would still work mostly the same. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little bit outside of our budget range, I have a suggestion for you there as well, and that suggestion is Gix Yawgmoth Praetor. So Gix is 1 black for a 3/3 legendary creature Phyrexian Praetor. Whenever a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, its controller may pay 1 life. If they do, they draw a card. Then you can pay 4 black and discard X cards to exile the top X cards of target opponent's library, and you may play lands and cast spells from among cards exiled this way without paying their mana costs. So again, there's a couple of key things going on with Gix that make him perfect for this deck. Number one is that he's going to be helping us draw cards, and the way that the actual ability on Gix reads is it happens as a trigger to the combat damage, which is exactly what's going to happen when we're converting Starscream. So if we don't have the front side of Starscream and we go to combat, we hit somebody, we can actually convert Starscream before we draw the cards with Gix, meaning that Starscream will then trigger when we draw the cards and make an opponent lose 2 life. So if we hit somebody and draw 5-6 cards, we can drain somebody out for 10 or 12 life and really start to take over the game, if not knock some people out of it. Additionally, Gix is going to be promoting a bunch of combat for our opponents as well, because our opponents can also be drawing cards and losing life, of course, if they hit our opponents. So that means we're incentivizing them to go after each other, leaving us probably to try to hang on to the Monarchy and the Initiative even more so than we were before. And if that all wasn't enough, Gix still has that ability at the end tacked on that we can just cast the top cards of our opponent's library by discarding whatever's in our hand. And once we get into the late game and our hand is full of maybe some card draw effects and maybe some 1/1 Deathtouchers, we can start replacing it for the giant bombs that may be on our opponent's top deck. So that is something to be aware of if your hand starts to get a little bit too rough, maybe it's full of land, something like that. But of course, if we're putting Gix into the deck, you would have to take a card out of the deck, and the card I would recommend would be Feast of Succession, which is 4 black for a sorcery. All creatures get -4/-4 until the end of turn, and you become the Monarch. So originally I put this in here as a potential board wipe that also lets us become the Monarch, but after a little bit of playtesting, I realized a couple of key problems with Feast of Succession. The first one is that it's only -4/-4, so it's not going to kill any of the big creatures in play. It is 6 mana for a sorcery, and 6 mana for a sorcery that still doesn't actually clear the board is pretty rough. And in playtesting, a lot of our creatures have 4 toughness or less, so this more than not actually just winds up killing our stuff and leaving our opponents with some of their bigger creatures, meaning they can just swing in, hit us, take the Monarchy anyway, and it really is a pretty feel-bad situation when it just wraths our own board and then we die because of it. So I don't think this is the deck for Feast of Succession. I really wanted to hope it was good, but I don't think this is the one for it. Obviously, if you wanted to keep it in, it is only 4 cents. It is easily replaceable, but I do think it can still do some key things if you need it to. But if you can, I do think Gix is a little bit stronger than that. So with all of that being said, of course, that is our deck tech. We got to take a look at how this deck performs in a game as well, see if we can match up with some opponents. But before we get to that, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. As always, you can just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit, and I genuinely appreciate everyone who is doing so. But if you would like to go a little bit above and beyond, you can find us over on Twitter, Reddit, you can send me an email. If you ever have suggestions for cards and you don't want to put them in the comments of the video, you can also send them to me on any of those platforms. And if you want to support us a little bit more directly, you can find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member. And once you've joined one of those two things, you get access to things like a Discord where we play a lot of the games that show up on the channel. And also I take deck building suggestions and things like that. So if people have ideas for what to put into decks, that is a great way to do it. And honestly, it's a great community. Everyone in the Discord is amazing. So if you're looking for a great group, that's probably a good place to look. You'll also get access to things like a guarantee that your deck suggestions will get turned into videos. You get access to cards sent to you every single month. You get access to the unedited gameplay videos and the deck lists an entire week early. So if that is something you're interested in, please do check us out, and you can join the amazing people listed below, such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Hui, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Paddywhack, Keegan Tawney, and Jakar. So to all of our current patrons and channel members, thank you all so much. And like I said, if you'd like to join them, please do check us out. But with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at our opponents for this game and see how we can actually do with Starscream in a 3 or 4 player game. In this case, we're going to be running up against Abdel Adrian Gorian's Ward and Agent of the Iron Throne, being played by Chris. We have Bane, Lord of Darkness, being played by JM, and Adewale, Breaker of Chains, being played by Hip. So you may have actually already seen this game. This was a game that was streamed a little while ago over on Chris's channel on Twitch. I will make sure to link that in the description. Do go check him out. He's an awesome streamer, does a lot of great content, and typically focuses on pauper decks. And speaking of pauper decks, his Abdel Adrian and Agent of the Iron Throne deck is actually a pauper deck. So his commanders are uncommon, but every other card in the deck is a common. And this is a very cool deck. His main goal is really just to make as many soldiers with Abdel as possible, and then find some ways to sacrifice those soldiers to trigger Agent of the Iron Throne and make his opponents lose life. So it's kind of an Orzhov Aristocrats deck, but he really focuses in on his commander, which is a super sweet idea, and Abdel is amazingly powerful and can definitely cause some shenanigans. Next up, we have JM's Bane deck. This is a Batman-themed deck, so if you watch the gameplay closely, you'll notice that all of his cards are proxied to be Batman-themed. They've got pictures of Batman stuff and characters and locations, and his commander himself is actually meant to be Batman, so it's very, very cool, very thematic, and there's a lot of sweet cards in there that just kind of tell the story of the Batman universe, and I wasn't lucky enough to get some pictures of the proxies, otherwise I would put them in here. But if you're interested, JM's got the deck. I'm sure he'd be happy to show it off, so do check him out as well. And then last but not least, we have Adewale, Breaker of Chains, being played by Hip. And from what Hip said, this is an Assassin's Creed themed deck, but it's not all Assassin's Creed. So he's got a lot of vehicles, he's got a lot of assassins, he's got a lot of the cards from the Assassin's Creed set. He specified that Adewale is one of his favorite characters. In fact, I think JM also said Adewale was his favorite character, so it works out pretty well for this game. And Adewale is... The entire deck that Hip put together was $20 total when it was first put together. I believe he mentioned that he played it with a group of his friends that all put together $20 decks. So it's very cool to see such cheap decks performing at such a high level, because Adewale is a phenomenally powerful commander, can definitely do some wild things. So I know that you're probably excited to get into the game, and we can move on from our deck tech. I'm very excited to show this game off. I think it was a ton of fun to play in, and of course, no spoilers because it has already happened, but I certainly enjoyed it. I'm sure you will too. And so let me know down in the comments what you think. Please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Chris, JM, and then Hip. On my first turn, I play a Swamp and cast Knight of the Ebon Legion. Chris plays a Swamp. JM plays an Arcane Sanctum. Hip plays a Swamp and then casts Changeling Outcast, which can't block or be blocked. I play a Swamp and then I attack JM for 1. Chris plays a Plains and casts Dark Ritual, making 3 black mana, and this lets him cast Mana Geode, scrying 1 when it enters, and he's also able to cast Thought Vessel, gaining no maximum hand size. JM plays a Wasteland, and then casts Esper Sentinel, letting him draw a card whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, unless that opponent pays additional mana equal to the Sentinel's power, which is currently 1. Hip plays an Island and attacks Chris for 1. I play a Miko Koro, Center of the Sea, and cast the converted side of my commander, Starscream Seeker Leader. Then, since it has haste, I'm able to attack Hip for 2, letting him become the Monarch when it deals damage. Chris plays a Plains and casts Ashnod's Altar, which lets him sacrifice a creature to make 2 colorless mana. He also doesn't pay for Esper Sentinel, letting JM draw a card. Then, he also casts Standard Bearer, forcing his opponents to choose a Flag Bearer in play when they cast a spell or activate an ability that could target a Flag Bearer. JM plays a Swamp and attacks Hip for 1 with Esper Sentinel, but before damage, he activates Ninjutsu on Yuriko, the Tiger's Shadow, returning the Sentinel to his hand and putting Yuriko in its place. This still does 1 damage to Hip and lets JM take the Monarchy, but it also has him reveal the top card of his library, which is a Plains, doing damage to each opponent equal to its mana value, which is 0. He also draws at the card at the end of turn for being the Monarch. Hip plays a Swamp and casts his commander Adewale, Breaker of Chains, revealing the top 6 cards of his library when he enters, and putting an Assassin, Pirate, or Vehicle from among them into his hand, this time getting Assassin Initiate. Finally, he attacks JM for 1 with the Changeling, retaking the Monarchy and drawing for it at the end of turn. On my turn, I move straight to combat, attacking Hip for 2 with Starscream, taking the Monarchy and converting my commander into Starscream Power Hungry, making target opponent lose 2 life whenever I draw a card, and also converting him back whenever I'm dealt combat damage. Then, in my second main phase, I play a Swamp and cast Passageway Seer, taking the initiative when it enters, venturing into the Undercity, searching my library for a basic land, and putting it into my hand. Then, when I move to my end step, I draw for being the Monarch, make Chris lose 2 life, and trigger the Seer, putting a +1/+1 counter on it since I have the initiative. On Chris's turn, he sacrifices Flag Bearer to Ashnod's Altar, making 2 colorless mana, and with this he's able to cast his commander, Abdel Adrian, Gorion's Ward, exiling the Thought Vessel and Mana Geode when he enters, making 2 soldier tokens since he exiled 2 permanents. Once that's resolved, he casts Ephemerate, exiling Abdel and returning him to play. This has his 2 mana rocks re-enter the battlefield, so Chris scries 1 and floats 2 mana, before re-exiling them when Abdel re-enters, making 2 more soldiers. Once that's resolved, he sacrifices a soldier for 2 mana to cast Nefarious Imp, letting him scry 1 whenever 1 or more permanents leave his battlefield. JM plays a Swamp and casts Kami's Obscura Oculus, so whenever he attacks, target attacking creature is unblockable this turn and it connives, then another attacking creature with lesser power gains double strike. This lets him attack me for 1 with Yuriko, making her unblockable, then revealing Boomerang from the top of his library with her trigger, doing 2 more damage to each opponent. This also means that JM becomes the Monarch and takes the initiative, letting him search his library for a basic land, putting it into his hand, while I convert Starscream back into Starscream Seeker Leader, and JM draws a card in his end step for being the Monarch. Hip plays an island, casts a Soul Ring, and then casts Decanter of Endless Water, giving him no maximum hand size. After that, he casts Fell Flagship, giving his pirates +1/+0, and attacks JM for 2 with the Changeling, taking the Monarchy and the initiative, searching his library for a basic land, putting it into his hand, and then drawing a card in his end step since he's the Monarch. On my turn, I play a Swamp and attack Hip for 2 with Starscream, retaking the Monarchy and the initiative, converting Starscream, and then scrying 2. In my second main phase, I cast Vicious Battle Rager, taking the initiative again, this time creating a treasure token, and after that, I use the treasure to cast Gifted Aetherborn. Then, when I move to my end step, I put another counter on the Seer and draw a card, making JM lose 2 life. In Chris's upkeep, his Ephemerate rebounds, so he casts it again for free, exiling Abdel and returning him to play, re-exiling his mana rocks and making 2 more soldiers. He then plays a Swamp and casts his background, Agent of the Iron Throne, making each opponent lose a life whenever a creature or artifact leaves his battlefield. At this point, he's able to constantly sacrifice Abdel and some soldiers to generate colorless mana, recasting Abdel from the command zone, exiling his mana rocks and imp to make 3 soldiers, which can then be sacrificed to keep making colorless mana. He can't generate enough mana to fully go infinite, but he does do a significant amount of damage, sacrificing a grand total of 16 creatures to do 16 damage to each of his opponents, eventually ending with Abdel in play, his mana rocks and imp exiled, and 3 soldier tokens. JM plays a swamp and casts his commander Bane, Lord of Darkness, then attacks Chris with Yuriko and Kamiz, giving Yuriko unblockable and Kamiz double strike, hitting him for 11 total damage. Then he reveals an austere command on the Yuriko trigger, doing another 6 damage to each opponent. On Hip's turn, he plays an island and casts Coastal Piracy, letting him draw a card whenever a creature he controls deals combat damage to an opponent. After that, he casts Golden Argosy, which exiles any number of creatures that crew it whenever it attacks, returning them to play at the end of turn. He then attacks me for 2 with Changeling Outcast, making me convert Starscream, drawing a card, taking the Monarchy and the Initiative, putting 2 +1/+1 counters on Changeling Outcast, then drawing a card at the end of turn. On my turn, I attack Hip with Starscream for 2 and attack Chris with the rest of my creatures for 8, also gaining 6. I once again reclaim the Monarchy and the Initiative, converting Starscream and make a 4/1 skeleton token with Menace. Then in my second main phase, I play a Swamp and cast Misfortune Teller, exiling Ephemerate from Chris's graveyard when it enters and gaining 3 life. Finally, I move to my end step, drawing a card and making JM lose 2 life. On Chris's turn, he cast Vessel of Endless Rest, putting Dark Ritual from his graveyard onto the bottom of his library. He then sacrifices Abdel, making each opponent lose a life, making 2 colorless mana and returning his permanents to play, letting him scry 1. JM plays a Ghost Quarter and casts Sun Titan, returning Orzhov Basilica from his graveyard to the battlefield when it enters, making him return Ghost Quarter to his hand. Then he replays the Ghost Quarter, which unfortunately he couldn't do since he'd already played a land this turn, and attacks Chris for Yuriko for 1, giving her unblockable, and Bane for 10 with double strike. Chris blocks Bane with a soldier, killing the token but returning his permanents to play, while he takes 2 from Yuriko after JM connives away a non-land, and then he reveals Meathook Massacre with her ability, doing 2 more damage to each opponent. Hip plays a Swamp and casts Crystal Skull Isu Spyglass, letting him look at and cast the top card of his library as long as it's historic. He then taps Adewale to crew the Golden Argosy, using it to attack Chris for 3, exiling Adewale on attacks, and also attacks me for 4 with the Changeling, retaking the Monarchy in the Initiative, goading Bane, drawing 2 cards, and making me convert Starscream. Then at the end of turn, Adewale returns to play, letting Hip put Vampire Assassin into his hand from the top of his library, and he draws a card for being the Monarch. On my turn, I move straight to combat, attacking Hip for 2 with Starscream, and I attack JM with the rest of my board for 16 total damage. Before blocks, Hip flashes in Rooftop Assassin, using it to block Starscream, killing it and gain 2 life since it has lifelink. JM opts not to block, getting knocked out of the game, while I gain a total of 7 life and also trigger Misfortune Teller, exiling Rooftop Assassin from Hip's graveyard and making a 2/2 rogue token. In my second main phase, I cast Night's Whisper, drawing 2 cards and losing 2 life, and also cast Ravenloft Adventurer, exiling any opponent's creature that would die and taking the initiative. This has me completing the Undercity, so I reveal the top 10 cards of my library and put a creature from among them into play with 3 +1/+1 counters and hexproof until my next turn. This lets me put Grave Titan into play, making 2 2/2 zombie tokens when it enters or attacks. Then at the end of turn, I put another counter on Passageway Seer and Knight of the Ebon Legion. Chris casts Suture Priest, gaining a life when a creature enters under his control and making an opponent lose a life when a creature enters under their control. Then he casts Stonehorn Dignitary, gaining a life and making me skip my next combat phase. At the end of turn, Hip casts Siren's Ruse, exiling Adewale and returning him to the battlefield, drawing a card because the exiled creature was a pirate and losing a life. Then Adewale re-enters and Hip puts Deadeye Quartermaster into his hand from the top of his library. On Hip's turn, he casts the Deadeye Quartermaster, losing a life, searching his library for an equipment or vehicle, getting Assassin Gauntlet and putting it into his hand. He then casts Opt, scrying 1 and drawing a card, before tapping the Quartermaster and Adewale to crew the Golden Argosy. He attacks me for 4 with the Changeling, and attacks Chris for 3 with the Argosy, exiling the Quartermaster and Adewale on attacks. Unfortunately, the Argosy returns the creatures at the next end step, but we forget about this and return them immediately. That means that when the Quartermaster and Adewale re-enter, Hip loses 2 life, searches his library for the Adrestia, putting it into his hand, and puts Desmond Miles into his hand from the top of his library. After this, damage happens and Hip draws 2 cards, reclaims the initiative, and makes a 4/1 skeleton token. Then, in his second main phase, he casts Foundry Inspector, making his artifact spells cost 1 less to cast. Once that's resolved, he also casts Assassin Initiate and a Smuggler's Copter. Then, at the end of turn, Hip draws a card for being the Monarch. On my turn, I play a Swamp and cast Dread, losing a life, but destroying any creature that would deal combat damage to me. On Chris's turn, he simply untaps and passes. In Hip's upkeep, he takes the initiative, finishing the Undercity, looking at the top 10 cards of his library and putting Thought Monitor into play from among them, with 3 +1/+1 counters and hexproof until his next turn, also drawing 2 cards when it enters. Once that's resolved, he casts Assassin Gauntlet, attaching it to the skeleton token and tapping all creatures I control. This gives the skeleton +1/+1 and lets Hip draw a card and discard a card whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent. After that, he casts Deadly Dispute, sacrificing Crystal Skull to make a treasure and draw 2 cards, and also plays a Rogue's Passage before crewing the Smuggler's Copter with Assassin Initiate. This lets him attack Chris with the Changeling and the Copter for exactly 7 damage, and attacks me with the rest of his board for exactly 16 damage, knocking us both out and winning Hip the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot going on, and everyone's deck really got the chance to kind of show off what it can do or its themes. Starting off with Chris, he had an amazing turn with Abdel where he sacrificed him, I want to say it was like 6 or 7 times. He eventually got Abdel to the point where he cost 14 mana to cast, which was wildly powerful magic stuff considering it was coming from an all-pauper deck. And it turns out Ashnod's Altar, just as powerful in Pauper as it is in normal Commander. So very, very cool to see. If you're interested in more Pauper stuff, do check out Chris's channel. He's got a lot of amazing Pauper content, and all of his decks are very, very cool. Moving on to our Batman deck being piloted by JM. There wasn't a ton that we got to see from it, unfortunately, and of course a couple of misplays with Camille where things were being given double strike that technically couldn't because of the way that it's worded with lesser power. We are aware of that, but unfortunately we didn't catch that in the game. So I don't really think that made an impact overall in the game, but it is something to be aware of for those that play Camille. But I do think the Batman deck was super cool. He had things like Yuriko was made up to be Catwoman, and Bane was made up to be Batman, and there were locations, and Boomerang was a Batarang, so it was very, very cool to see, very thematic, and you can definitely tell that there was a lot of love put into that deck. And then, of course, we got to talk about our winner, Hip, who played a very strong game with Adewale. Again, unfortunately, some mistakes made throughout the game, but I don't think they really changed anything about how the game ended. The Golden Argosy returning things immediately rather than at the end step, I don't think made a difference throughout the course of the game. And Hip himself did catch that toward the end where we realized that wasn't quite how it played. But very, very cool deck. A very big shout out to Hip for the victory. It's always nice to see a cheap budget deck come out on top, especially one with a character as cool as Adewale built around it. So very sweet to see. And then last but not least, of course, our deck did exactly what it wanted to do. It made a ton of Deathtouch creatures, drew a ton of cards. It finished the Undercity with the Initiative. It took the Monarchy many times. And unfortunately, the downfall of our deck was that one little Changeling Outcast, because if we didn't have something coming at us every single turn that was unblockable, there's a good chance we would have been the only player in that game to have the Monarchy or the Initiative, and we probably could have run away with it, but that one little unblockable 1/1 just kind of stopped us in our tracks. So that is something to be aware of if you're playing the deck, that unblockable is a little bit tricky to deal with, but still a ton of fun nonetheless. I had a great time playing this deck, which, I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not much of a mono black player, but this one I think kind of fits that niche for me, so it was a ton of fun. Let me know, though, down in the comments if there's any cards you think we could add to this deck or maybe take out that aren't good enough. And of course, let me know if there's any cards you'd like to see me build around in the future. I will certainly do my best to get to all of the suggestions. But with all of that being said, thank you all so much for watching. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.